Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. Time for the view from the opposition. And we've got Daniel Blackham returning to the podcast. He was only on a few weeks ago when Newcastle travelled down to Brentford and ultimately lost their 4-2 at the G-Tech. But this time around, it's Brentford heading up to Tyneside. And we're well aware of their horrendous record away from home. Daniel, welcome back to the show. How are you keeping? You well?
Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, looking forward to this Wednesday.
But are you really? Because you're away from
No,
home. So can you look forward to it?
not at all. No, to be perfectly honest, I had hoped when I saw these two games quite close to each other, I hoped Brentford would win one of them. And to be honest, I thought it was going to be this Wednesday that they would win because Brentford hadn't been Newcastle in the league for so long. So then when we ended up winning in the league, I thought, oh, actually, here we go, might be on for two. And then seeing them away from home again last night against Chelsea was just, yeah, it didn't fill me with confidence about them playing anywhere other than the G-Tech at the moment.
This is going to sound either like a really good question or a really stupid question, but given that you're so bad on the road, does it not hurt as much when you lose because you're just used to losing? Obviously, you want to get rid of that loss every single time you're away from the G-Tech, but given that it happens so often, it's like no longer a shock sort of thing?
I mean, it's definitely not a shock. I wouldn't say that it's a shock when we lose away from home. It still doesn't make it any easier, even though it makes games seem sort of 20% harder with the form they're currently in. I think, to be perfectly honest, it's just frustrating more than anything because you look at how good they are at home. I think they're still the best home team across the top five leagues from the first however many games it is, and you think if they did half of that away from home as well, all of a sudden you're looking at, can they challenge for European place? Whereas now, with the start they made away from home, it's okay. Is it going to be 10th or 12th? Is that the realistic position that we're looking at? And it's just a bit of a shame, really, to be perfectly honest, because there's so much talent in that squad. There's so much potential to make a push towards Europe, and I think we've got the players to do that. It's just they can't seem to get it going anywhere away from home. So it's just frustrating, really.
And what is the issue away from home? Because as you say, best home record in the league, tremendous players. Me speaking as a Newcastle United fan, I would take 3 or 4 of your stars to come up to Tyneside and play in black and white. So what is the difference from playing at home to away? Like, and it's not just a bad run of form away from home. It is absolutely dreadful, isn't it? So why?
Yeah. I mean, to be perfectly honest, that's the sort of $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, you can put it down to a few things. You can put it down to just the fact that they are so comfortable at home. And so you can put it down as being a good thing about the home form rather than a bad thing about the away form. But at the end of the day, it's, I think, a lot to do with the approach away from home. You saw that, in the league, I think every home game so far, they've played the same sort of 4-3-3 system. I know against Newcastle, Thomas Frank proved me completely wrong in what I said pre-match. I mean, I said the Brentford would play a 4-3-3 with Thiago coming off the bench. He ended up starting, and they played sort of a 4-2-2, as it were, to get those two tens in behind the two strikers. Whereas away from home, you see last night against Chelsea, and I know that it's difficult because it's Chelsea. They are challenging for the Premier League title, but you could see the reaction online when the team was announced and we gone to a back five, and it's just so much more negative. There seems to just be so much more respect shown to teams when they go away from home. It seems to be that away from home, they're more than willing to let the opposition have a lot more of the ball and try and hit on the counter, which has worked in the past. So, that's not that's not me saying that Thomas Frank's wrong because it's worked in the past. It just seems to be that there's this sort of bit of a negative attitude away from home and just sort of, as I say, a bit too much respect shown to teams. I fear that's going to be the same on Wednesday night. I'm expecting that Newcastle will be close to a sellout, if not a sellout, for this game. And we all know what the St James's Park crowd is like. It's basically the 12th man. So there is the fear that are they going to show a little bit too much respect? Are they going to then again revert back to a back five? And it's even if they do keep with a 4 at the back and 4-3-3, it's just about how they press the ball. There's a lot more sort of stagnant pressing away from home, and I think that's a large part of it.
And obviously, it must be a bit of a mindset as well. Will it be different on Wednesday because it is 90 minutes of football? You can't play the long game, i.e., we pick up a point here, we can build on that next week. It's you lose and you're out of the cup. So maybe that might benefit Brentford to a certain degree where they're not stuck in that negative mindset.
I mean, I really hope so. And again, I do think the cup's a bit of an anomaly when it comes to form, because Thomas Frank is desperate to win the Carabao Cup, and I know that stating the obvious, manager wants to win a trophy, but I think that he's very much viewed the Carabao Cup, over the last few years as being a competition that Brentford can realistically win. Only the most hardened Brentford fan would say we can challenge for the Premier League title within the next 30 years. The FA Cup is a lot more difficult because the bigger teams take it a lot more seriously. So I think the Carabao Cup has always been one that he's sort of taken a little bit more seriously. So he has, treated every game as, playing a strong team. We saw that in one of the earlier rounds when he brought Norgard back from injury because he wanted to have that experienced player in, and I think it was against Leyton Orient in that game. So that showed just how seriously he takes it against, no disrespect, the smaller teams. And so I think that will then bleed into the attitude shift on Wednesday. I would hope so anyway. I think that you can expect to see Brentford play quite similarly to how they played in the league, pressing from the front. I'm not too sure how they'll line up because there's a few unexpected injuries, let's say, that have crept up over the last few days. So who they line up with could be slightly different, but in terms of how they play, I think that Thomas Frank definitely views the Carabao Cup as a realistic target that we can at least go far in. So I would expect to see a little bit more positivity away from home on Wednesday, yeah.
So I was going to ask you whether you will take it seriously. Then I checked the lineup for the game against Sheffield Wednesday, which Brentford won on penalties, and it was quite a strong side, because I always think back to the last time these two clubs faced off in the quarterfinals of this competition. Brentford were in the Championship and played a really weakened side, but played Newcastle off the park under Steve Bruce, and it was an awful performance for Newcastle, awful result. And obviously the reason Thomas Frank did that was because he was concentrating on promotion, etc., etc. But I was a little bit surprised when I saw the lineup for the Sheffield Wed game that he had actually played as strong as a team as he did.
For sure. I mean, I think that to a certain extent, there's no reason not to on Wednesday night. With all due respect to some of the weaker teams in the Premier League, I don't think too many at Brentford are concerned about relegation. I don't think there's too much of a concern about being dragged down into a relegation battle, especially if we manage to keep certain players injury free. And so from that point of view, it's sort of, well, I know that there's a hectic fixture schedule in the Premier League coming up, but why not go for it in the Carabao Cup and see if we can, even if he took us to the final, even if we beat Newcastle on Wednesday night and ended up, winning again and going to the final, that cements Thomas Frank's legacy at Brentford even further. So there's no reason for him to sort of say, you know what, okay, we'll drop Mark Fleckham for this one and we'll drop Nathan Collins, give him a rest. I'll be really surprised if that happened. And I just say the same for the Sheffield Wednesday game. They played a strong team because, again, I think that it's one that he views as attainable. I think that he views it as a competition that even if we don't win, we can really progress far in. We saw back in the 2020 season when beat Newcastle United in the quarterfinals, ended up in the semi-finals, and again he played a strong team against Tottenham in the semi-final. At that point, obviously, we were challenging for promotion at the same time. This season in the Premier League, we don't really have as much to focus on in terms of league football. So I would expect him to take this very seriously on Wednesday. Yeah, I would expect an almost full strength, even if injuries slightly prohibit that.
Yep, and the same from this point of view as well. I think Newcastle will play their strongest team possible. I think Alexander Isak will start. I think we'll probably see an unchanged side, really, I think, to the one that beat Leicester 4-0, because this is Newcastle's best chance of silverware, probably the best chance of getting into Europe, given how their season's gone so far. And just because of results recently, losing to Brentford, losing to West Ham, Newcastle United having beaten Leicester 4-0, they need to build on that result and performance by beating Brentford and going through, and then beating Ipswich on Saturday as well. So it's all about momentum and going into the new year in good form. So I think Eddie Howe will do his best to play his strongest side. And they've faced two Premier League opposition already, beat Forest on penalties and beat Chelsea as well. Whereas this is Brentford's first test of Premier League opposition in this competition. They beat Colchester away, so it can happen. As you mentioned there, Leyton Orient and then Sheffield Wednesday. So it's not been an easy run to this stage, but not as tough as some of the other paths that Newcastle, for instance, have had to follow.
Yeah, I mean, there's no denying the fact that, as you say, this is Brentford's first Premier League test in the competition. So I think you can say that it's been a slightly easier run to get to this point. But I mean, with that in mind, I feel like getting over the hump against Newcastle, what was it, last week or the week before? I feel like that's going to be massive for the confidence going into Wednesday, because it means that it just makes the team talk a little bit easier. You can say, okay, well, this is where we know that we can attack them because this is how we attacked them last time. This is where we had success. And obviously it'll be slightly different with the team changing and personnel wise. I think that's going to be the main thing in the preparation for this one is sort of saying, okay, well, we only just beat them last week. It's still fresh in the memory. Whereas Newcastle have played various Premier League teams in the sort of in the cup already to get to this point, but they've struggled in the league at the same time over that sort of same spell. So you'd imagine that this is going to be a case of, yes, they haven't had the toughest run to get to this point, but they've still beaten everyone who they've had to. They've had to grind out results at times. There's been a few nervy performances when you've sort of thought, okay, well, what's going on here? Why are we struggling so much against certain teams? And again, no disrespect to those teams in the lower leagues, but I say Brentford have beaten everyone that they've had to get to this point. And I think that win against Newcastle is just going to be so valuable to their confidence, to their tactical preparation. So I think that will sort of override, as it were, the easier run in.
Well, I hope Eddie Howe's saying the same about his team talking, saying this is where they got at us the last time, just a couple of weeks ago, and this is where we can't afford to fail again. I think the Brentford game away at the G-Tech, again, it was a tale of two halves where Newcastle United were good in the first half. They should have had 2-3 goals. They hadn't taken the chances. And there was a moment against Leicester on Saturday. Again, Newcastle had 2, 3, 4 great chances in the first half, only scored one of them. And you're sitting there at half time thinking, are we going to see history repeat itself? We did against West Ham. We did against Brentford. Thankfully, it didn't happen and Newcastle went out 4-0 winners. And I think that would be a huge, huge boost to Newcastle going into the game on Wednesday because, the second half nightmare hasn't happened and Newcastle have scored a boatload of goals. I mean, how easy will it be for Brentford to replicate what they did a couple of weeks ago against Newcastle?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I was really surprised by that Newcastle game at the GSEC. I was really surprised with, a couple of things. I thought it was quite alarming how sort of short of confidence Newcastle seemed at the back. Whenever any of the back four got on the ball, they always seemed a little bit nervy. The same with Nick Pope. I know that was that incident in the last couple of minutes when Mbeumo took the ball off him and could have scored. Dan Burn rescued it off the line. I was really, really surprised by that. I was really surprised by, as well, how good Alexander Isak was. So the fact that you've said that he's going to be starting on Wednesday, that instantly fills me with dread because he's an incredible footballer. And I think that if Newcastle can hold on to him for another year, they'd be incredibly lucky. So in terms of replicating it all depends on personnel in a way. I would imagine that Newcastle will be largely the same lineup. Would you imagine Livramento will play instead of Trippier? That's the sort of one that could change.
Yeah,
and again, that's one that Mbeumo or Sade could get at.
That could be the one change that might happen, Trippier in for Livramento, but the rest of it, I would imagine, would be unchanged, just simply because why change a winning side, especially when you've had a bit of a bad run of form. I can't see anyhow really changing up too much unless there's injuries that we don't know about or fatigue. But you would imagine everyone that can play will want to play in this game because it's a chance to get to a semi-final. So it could be, a great night for Newcastle.
Yeah, that's the thing. You'd imagine if that's the big sort of if, isn't it? It's if there's injuries, which you never really know about until game time. But if it's largely the same team, then I would expect Brentford to play largely the same team as well. There was a couple of surprises in the team for the Premier League game. There was Thiago started, Igor Thiago. I thought he looked really impressive holding the ball up. He was sort of holding his own against the Newcastle centre-backs. And while he didn't create any chances for himself, he was creating chances for others. And having those quick wingers as well was vital in that game. I thought Kevin Sade played really well when he came on. The big thing now is that Igor Thiago was injured last night. And Thomas Frank didn't announce that until the squad was announced and Thiago wasn't in it. So I think fans were a little bit unhappy about that one because it's sort of, okay. instantly makes us a little bit more negative in that sense, taking a striker out of the squad. I would imagine that if he's back, he'll play on Wednesday night, but do they want to then rush him back in if he's had an injury? Do they want to rush him back into the starting lineup? So I'd imagine it'll be slightly different to the league game, but I would imagine the way that they play will be largely the same in terms of attacking, in terms of pressing from the front. And hopefully it's like I predicted the Premier League game would be, with Kevin Sade starting on one of the wings and, really putting the back four under pressure, putting Nick Pope under pressure, as you saw with Mbeumo in the last minute in the Premier League game. You would imagine that Wissa will play. There's no real reason for him not to, unless there's an injury that we don't know about. And then in midfield, Norgaard's back, so that's a massive one for us. He played really well the last couple of games. Vitaly Janelt's available. I believe Christopher Ayer will be available, and that sort of gives the defensive side of the team a lot more strength, a lot more size when it comes to dealing with the likes of Alexander Isak. So that's how I would imagine that they'll sort of line up and approach it.
Well, Nick Pope actually picked up an injury in that game against Brentford, so he's out for the next month. So it'll likely be Martin Dubravka, who had nothing to do against Leicester. And it's interesting because you mentioned there how easy it was in many ways for Brentford's attackers to get the better of Newcastle's defence at the G-Tech. And, against Leicester, for all it was a great performance by Newcastle United, 4 goals scored, you celebrate that. Leicester did not threaten at all. So it's not like Martin Dubravka's been warmed up. He's coming from the cold.
Yeah.
I think the last time he probably started maybe was, I don't know, one of these cup games off the top of my head, or maybe even last season. So, if he comes in, if he will start on Wednesday, I would imagine. And it might be the first time he's really been tested in a few months. And the same with the defence, they kept a clean sheet, but Leicester were never going to score a goal. So you do wonder what happens when they go up against a threatening side. But my big hope has to be that, if Wissa plays and Mbeumo plays, is that Lewis Hall, Fabian Schär, they've learned from their mistakes against Brentford. Lewis Hall, he's been brilliant all season, brilliant again against Leicester, but he showed Mbeumo inside and what's going to happen, exactly what Mbeumo did, put one at the back of the net. And, Fabian Schär backing off Wissa, you can't do that. So we have to hope from Newcastle point of view, those mistakes have been learned from. And, if they get the chances to hurt Newcastle, they're a lot closer and they know how to nullify that threat. Just going back to, the away form, obviously, like Thomas Frank in the dressing room, we'll be talking about them having an opportunity to get to the semi-final, and this is what it's all about, winning the cup. But it does all come back to that away form. So what does he say to them?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, in terms of a dressing room talk, it's got to be so hard to get over the away form. I mean, there's no escaping it. There's no escaping the fact that every time they play away from the G-Tech, they seem to struggle. And it seems to be a mental struggle as well, in terms of, as I've said, that attitude, just that positive attitude towards, aggressive pressing, and in terms of, dominating the ball. Against Chelsea last night, it was basically a case of Chelsea would have the ball for about 35 minutes or so. Brentford would have it for 10. That was the sort of the split of play. And that's going to be something that's really difficult for him to overcome, just in terms of the mental approach to the game. But again, I think that win over Newcastle in the league has got to be so important for him to say, it's very rare to play a team twice in such quick succession. And it's got to be so much better when you've beaten that team in the first occasion, because you can say, even if it's a case of saying to the defence, you dealt with Isak before. I know that he scored and he looked threatening, but this is how you dealt with him last time. Have that little bit of a strength in the tackle whenever he gets the ball. Press on him just a half second quicker, that sort of thing. So there's definitely the experience of having beaten Newcastle. It's got to be fresh in the mind, and you hope that overrides the negative away form. But there's no way of masking it. There's no way of because some of the away performances have been terrible as well. It's not like it's not. There's been the thrillers that they've had at the G-Tech where they've lost 4-3 away from home and 5-4 and that sort of thing. It's been games that we've been largely out of for 70% or more of the game, and that's the sort of thing that you can't just expect to turn up away from home and hit teams on the counter every time and have 5% of the ball and still hurt teams. That's been the case in the past, and that's been the case, for some of the most famous victories in in Brentford's recent history. You think back to, I know it was a couple of years ago, but away at the Etihad, they basically let City have the ball the entire time, hit them on the counter, scored late on when City flooded men forward. Largely a lot of the same players in that team, and so they're used to playing in a way that away from home they will accept they're not going to have the same amount of possession. But I mean, it's got to be such a difficult mind block to get over. So it's going to be really difficult for Thomas Frank to instill in his players that you don't have to play the same way you do at home. You don't have to throw everyone forward and attack the ball every single time. But there's got to be the balance between just showing too much respect and sitting off teams compared to then attacking every time they get the ball.
Yeah, and just a reminder of that away form: 8 played, 1 draw, 7 defeats, goals against 16. So they come into this on really bad ground for traveling away from the G-Tech. It's going to be really interesting to see how both teams approach it. By what you're saying there, Daniel, that you think it will be a case that Newcastle will have the majority of the ball.
I would imagine so. Yeah. Again, it all depends on personnel, because it all depends on whether they play. Hopefully he doesn't play 5 again at the back like he did yesterday, because that means that just by definition of how that lineup works, you're expecting to sit more players behind the ball and show more respect to the opposition and let them have the ball more. So if it is a 5, then you can expect to see exactly that. You can expect to see Newcastle dominating the ball in the midfield and looking to play out into the wide areas where Brentford's fullbacks, there's no escaping it. Even in a 5, they're still weak, because they simply aren't fullbacks. You've got Keane Lewis-Potter, who's a left winger, and you've got Sepp Vandenberg, who's predominantly a centre back. He'll probably play in either the right centre back position or the right wing back position. And as you say, there's no escaping that they're not fullbacks. So when Newcastle get the ball, they will probably look to play it out wide. But if it is a 4, then you can probably expect them to be a little bit more like it was in the Premier League game, just by definition of having more players available in the midfield and then more players available up top, further up the field. So if it's a 4, you can probably expect to see more pressing, more aggressive pressing from front. And I'd actually forgotten about Nick Pope's injury, so that, with no disrespect to Martin Dubravka, can possibly make things a little bit easier for Brentford. I just say he's coming into the game a little bit cold. Get some shots off early, see if you can test him, see if you can cause problems. There's no way that Thomas Frank won't be thinking exactly that and telling that to his forward line. It just all depends on how the team sets up, because there really is 2 different sides of Brentford. There's the sitting off and showing too much respect to teams, and then there's the aggressive pressing on the front foot, and that'll all depend on how the lineup works. So if it's a 5, you can expect sitting. If it's a 4 at the back, you can expect a little bit more pressure.
One to watch, but it was good to see Newcastle United being a bit more comfortable with the majority of possession against Leicester. Had just under 60% of the possession, 600 odd passes, 800 odd touches. Again, we have to caveat that by saying Leicester were god awful, but you've got to beat what's in front of you. And Newcastle United did it comfortably, and they looked comfortable passing the ball around the back and just breaking down Leicester. Just before we get Dan's score prediction, just remind you that this episode is sponsored by NordVPN, and you can get yourself a very special discounted offer on your NordVPN plan. Keep yourself safe and at the same time help support the podcast. You really are supporting us when you sign up to your monthly subscription of NordVPN, and there is a very special offer on that link in the podcast description box, which means you can get a few extra months on top of your 2-year plan. So click it, keep yourself safe this Christmas, and once again support the podcast. Thank you very much. Dan, how's it going to go then on Wednesday night?
I'm finding it really difficult to predict a score. I'm going to say that it's going to be decided within the 90. I don't think that it'll go to penalties. Again, I'm going to cheat a little bit and give you 2 different score predictions, and one of them is dependent on if we play a 5 at the back, and I'm going to say that'll be a 2-0 to Newcastle, because as I just said, I don't think that Brentford will have that same success with playing on the counter. If Brentford go out and attack, then I'll go 2-1 to Brentford. I think that Brentford can really, really hurt any team in this league if they play the right way, and they've shown that at home. Fingers crossed this is the time they do it away from home.
I really hope it's not. You can pick up your away form after Wednesday night. Hopefully, they do play 5 at the back, and Newcastle United can get through to the semi-final. I mean, whoever gets through is going to face a really tough task to get through at the final, because there's some top teams still in this competition. But fingers crossed, from our point of view anyway, ladies and gents, Newcastle United beat Brentford on Wednesday and get through to that 2-legged semi-final. Thank you for Dan to coming on the podcast once again. It's much appreciated you taking the time. So you guys watching and listening, get into the comments, give the video a thumbs up. If you're on the audio platform, do leave us a rating and a review and share it across your social media platforms. It's much appreciated. As always, head over to chroniclive.co.uk, where we will bring you the build up to this game. For myself, I will see you later in the week.